Humans are the only large mammal species that, without any specialized physical adaptation built in from the start, managed to settle in essentially every climate zone on the planet. Not thanks to fur, like an Arctic fox. Not thanks to a water-storing hump, like a camel. Not thanks to lungs evolved for thin mountain air, like a yak. Humans don't have a single one of these built-in tools. And yet humans turned out to be the only primate to reach the Arctic Circle, cross deserts with no water source for hundreds of kilometers, settle at altitudes where there isn't even enough oxygen for a normal night's sleep, and build a life in glacial age Europe. How? The answer isn't really biology in the narrow sense, even though biology did play a role. The answer lies in a remarkable combination of technology, social cooperation, and the ability to pass knowledge down across generations. This is what anthropologists sometimes call a cultural species, a species that evolves less through its body and more through its ideas. Today we'll walk through 5 survival stories from 5 very different edges of habitability on this planet: the Arctic, the desert, the mountains, glacial Europe, and the tropical rainforest. Each one poses its own, completely distinct survival challenge, and each one reveals a different set of solutions our ancestors worked out long before they had anything resembling modern science. Why the Arctic isn't just cold, it's the ultimate test. Of all the climatic challenges humans have faced, the Arctic is the least forgiving of mistakes. There's no room for the wrong clothing, the wrong shelter, a miscalculated fuel supply for the fire. Winter temperatures can drop to -40 or 50 degrees Celsius. Daylight all but disappears for weeks at a time in winter, and the only available resources are animals, ice, and whatever little you can carry with you. The human body isn't physiologically built for these conditions on its own. We don't have a dense undercoat, our skin loses heat quickly, and frostbite on exposed extremities can set in within minutes, in severe cold, without protection. And yet, people didn't just survive in the Arctic, they lived there continuously, generation after generation, long before anything resembling modern technology existed. The first people north of the Arctic Circle. For a long time, scientists believed humans colonized truly high latitudes relatively late, only during the Holocene, after the last ice age ended. But excavations at the Yana site in northern Siberia, in the Yana River basin, far above the Arctic Circle, changed that picture. Artifacts and worked animal remains found there date back roughly 45,000 years, meaning anatomically modern humans were already living in extreme Arctic cold long before the peak of the last glaciation. This discovery means humans pushed into the Arctic, not as a final frontier, settled only after every more hospitable region had already been claimed, but almost immediately after moving out of the warmer regions of Eurasia, remarkably fast, by historical standards. Technology as a substitute for fur. Since the body offered no natural protection, that protection had to be manufactured artificially, and this is exactly where the Arctic became one of the major drivers of technological progress among early humans. The key invention was sewn clothing, not simply draped skins. Finds of eyed bone needles, dated to tens of thousands of years ago, are direct archaeological evidence of the shift from wrapping hides around the body to actually tailoring multi-layered garments, an inner layer to retain body heat, an outer layer to block wind and moisture. Clothing like this, researchers estimate, could support survival at temperatures that would otherwise be lethal within hours. The second pillar of survival was fire. Not just a heat source, but a tool for cooking food, purifying water, and, importantly, a social hub around which community life concentrated during the long polar nights. The third element was shelter, built from whatever was literally at hand in a landscape with no trees to speak of on the open tundra. At sites like Mezherych in modern-day Ukraine, archaeologists have found dwellings built from mammoth bones and tusks, essentially entire architectural structures, where bones served as a load-bearing frame with hides stretched over the top. It's a striking example of how the absence of familiar building materials didn't stop people. It forced them to invent an entirely new approach to construction. Hunting megafauna as a survival strategy. In an environment where plant food is available only a few months a year and barely at all in winter, large animals became the primary source of calories, fat, and raw materials. Mammoths, woolly rhinoceroses, reindeer, bison. Meat provided energy. Fat provided concentrated calories, critical in a cold climate where the body burns enormous amounts of energy, just maintaining core temperature. And hides, bones, and sinew went into clothing, shelters, and tools. Hunting such large and dangerous prey required coordinated group strategies rather than solo effort drives, using terrain to advantage, spears tipped with stone or bone points. That, in turn, demanded developed communication and social organization, another example of how physical survival in the Arctic directly pushed forward the development of social and cognitive abilities. The body's physiological adaptation to cold, beyond cultural solutions. Populations that have lived in the Arctic for many generations, such as the Inuit, Nenets, and Yakuts, eventually developed certain biological traits as well. According to what's known in biology as Bergmann's and Allen's rules, populations adapted to cold climates tend, on average, towards stockier builds and relatively shorter limbs, a body shape that reduces the ratio of surface area to volume and thereby lowers heat loss. A number of Arctic populations, the Inuit in particular, show genetic traits linked to fat metabolism, specifically gene variants involved in processing fatty acids, which appear to reflect a centuries-long adaptation to a diet heavy in marine mammal fat. Some research also points to increased brown fat activity, the tissue responsible for thermogenesis, generating heat without muscle shivering in populations that have long lived in cold climates. But it's worth stressing, these biological changes are a supplement, not the foundation of survival. The foundation is culture, clothing, fire, shelter, hunting strategies, and knowledge passed down through generations. Culture is what let humans settle the Arctic almost as soon as they got there, without waiting for evolution to build an Arctic version of the human body. The opposite extreme, too much heat, not enough water. If the Arctic kills through cold, the desert kills the opposite way through relentless sun, extreme swings between day and night temperatures, and above all, the near-total absence of water. A human can survive several weeks without food, but usually no more than a few days without water. And in desert heat, that window shrinks to a matter of hours under any real physical exertion. That said, deserts haven't always been as dry as the ones we know today. The Sahara, for example, went through what's known as its green period, roughly 11,000 to 5,000 years ago, when it was a savanna with rivers, lakes, and fairly rich wildlife, meaning people settled the region under far more favorable conditions than exist there now. But as the climate dried out, the groups living there had to either migrate or work out strategies for living in an increasingly arid environment. Knowledge of the land as the primary survival tool. For peoples who have long lived in deserts such as the sand bushmen of the Kalahari Desert in southern Africa, the key survival resource wasn't some piece of technical gear, but a phenomenally detailed knowledge of the land, accumulated and passed down across generations. The sand knew how to find water in places where, at first glance, there seemed to be none at all. In water-storing tubers buried underground, in the stems of certain vine species, in rock hollows, after rare rainfall, and by relying on the wild sama melon, a fruit that's about 90% water, and, in season, becomes the primary source of hydration for entire groups of hunter-gatherers. This kind of knowledge, which plant, in which location, at which time of year holds water or is edible, represented an enormous body of practical information built up over countless generations through trial and error. Another tool was the use of ostrich eggshells as natural containers, filled with water and buried in the sand at strategically important points along migration routes, effectively creating a network of hidden water caches for future use. A daily rhythm built around the heat, not against it. Desert peoples have long structured their days around temperature extremes rather than fighting them. Most activity, travel, hunting, gathering happened in the early morning and evening, when temperatures were more bearable, while the hottest hours of the day were spent in shade and shelter, in a state of minimal physical exertion to cut down on fluid loss through sweat. Clothing in desert cultures, counterintuitively for anyone assuming you should strip down in the heat, was often kept fairly covering loose but tightly woven fabrics shielded the skin from direct sun exposure, while also slowing the rate of moisture evaporation, a strategy proven over centuries in many traditional desert cultures, including the nomadic peoples of the Sahara. The human body as a purpose-built heat machine. Here's an important aside. The desert is nearly the only extreme environment where the human body itself, unlike in the Arctic, turns out to be remarkably well suited from the start, not just culturally, but physiologically. The human capacity for sweating is one of the most developed thermoregulation systems among all mammals. Unlike most animals, which cool down primarily through rapid panting, humans can produce and evaporate large volumes of sweat across nearly the entire body surface, cooling effectively even during intense physical activity in the heat. Combined with the relatively sparse body hair covering humans, another trait that, according to one anthropological hypothesis, may have evolved specifically as an adaptation for hunting in hot, open landscapes. This makes humans one of the few mammals capable of so-called persistence hunting, chasing down prey on foot for hours in high heat until the animal, overheating without an equally efficient cooling system, collapses from exhaustion. This hunting strategy has been documented by ethnographers among Kalahari peoples right up to the present day. Modern heirs of desert traditions. The San of the Kalahari, Aboriginal peoples of Central Australia, the Tuareg, and other nomadic groups of the Sahara, all of them developed, over thousands of years, unique bodies of knowledge that make it possible to live where, at first glance, life shouldn't be possible at all. These cultures demonstrate that surviving the desert is, first and foremost, not a question of one person's physical endurance, but a question of accumulated, carefully transmitted collective knowledge about terrain, plants, animals, and water knowledge. No single person could ever rediscover alone within one lifetime. The unique problem of altitude. Mountain plateaus and highlands present a challenge entirely different from Arctic cold or desert dryness. A lack of oxygen. Above roughly 3,500–4,000 meters, atmospheric pressure and the corresponding partial pressure of oxygen drop significantly compared to sea level, triggering altitude sickness in anyone unadapted. Headaches, shortness of breath, disrupted sleep, and in severe cases, pulmonary or cerebral edema, which can be fatal. On top of that come cold, intense ultraviolet radiation due to the thinner atmospheric layer, sharp temperature swings between day and night, and generally sparse vegetation, which limits available food resources. Settling the Tibetan Plateau. The Tibetan Plateau, one of the most difficult places on the planet to inhabit permanently, with an average elevation above 4,500 meters, turned out to be settled by humans remarkably early. Archaeological evidence, including finds at Baishia Karst Cave, points to human presence in the region tens of thousands of years ago, and the famous Denisovan jawbone discovered in that very cave showed that even another branch of humanity, the Denisovans, inhabited this extreme altitude long before modern humans arrived. Researchers link the sustained, dense settlement of the plateau by the ancestors of today's Tibetans to a period roughly 30,000 to 40,000 years ago, followed by more extensive settlement during the Holocene, when groups arrived who would go on to become the ancestors of the present-day Tibetan population. A gene inherited from the Denisovans. One of the most striking examples in the entire history of studying human evolution is how modern Tibetans acquired a critical genetic adaptation for high-altitude life, not through their own slow process of natural grounds selection, but through interbreeding with a long-extinct group of humans, the Denisovans. The gene in question is a variant of EPAS1, widespread among modern Tibetans and largely absent in most other populations worldwide, including neighboring Han Chinese populations. This gene variant regulates the body's response to low oxygen levels specifically. It prevents the body from overproducing red blood cells in response to hypoxia, which matters because excessive blood thickening from an overabundance of red blood cells, a common pattern in unadapted people living long-term at altitude, raises the risk of cardiovascular complications. Genetic analysis has shown that this EPAS1 variant in Tibetans is nearly identical to the variant found in the Denisovan genome, direct evidence that the ancestors of Tibetans once interbred with Denisovans and inherited this critically useful gene variant from them, which was then favored by natural selection as exceptionally valuable specifically for life at high altitude. A different path of adaptation. The Andes. Interestingly, indigenous populations of the high Andes in South America, facing the very same problem of oxygen scarcity, arrived at a completely different physiological solution since their ancestors settled the Andes considerably later and independently of the settlement of Tibet, without access to that same Denisovan genetic inheritance. In Andean populations, adaptation to altitude is expressed primarily through elevated hemoglobin levels in the blood. The body compensates for the oxygen shortage by producing more red blood cells to carry whatever oxygen is available in the thin air. This is fundamentally different from the Tibetan strategy, which instead tries to avoid an excessive rise in red blood cell count. Both solutions work, but they're evolutionarily entirely independent of one another. A classic example of convergent, but not identical, adaptation to the same ecological challenge. Mountain peoples today. Modern Sherpas of Nepal, Tibetans, and the inhabitants of the high Andes all demonstrate that the human body is capable of profound physiological adjustment to the extreme conditions of altitude, but that adjustment required tens of thousands of years of selection. And, in the Tibetan case, a fortunate genetic inheritance from a long-extinct relative branch of humanity. It's another lesson from the history of settling the Earth. Sometimes survival in an extreme environment isn't so much the achievement of a single generation's ingenuity as it is a long process, stretched across millennia, and at times, across entire species, of accumulating both cultural and biological solutions. The world of the last glacial maximum. Roughly 26,000 to 19,000 years ago, Earth went through a period known as the last glacial maximum, a time when enormous ice sheets covered much of northern Europe and the territory of what is now France, Germany, and parts of Eastern Europe was a cold, wind-swept periglacial steppe, the so-called mammoth steppe, with vegetation adapted to extreme cold and characteristic megafauna, mammoths, woolly rhinoceroses, reindeer, cave lions. Under these conditions, it wasn't just isolated bands of hardy survivors living day-to-day entire stable communities of anatomically modern humans, sometimes referred to by archaeologists as Cro-Magnons. After the French cave where some of the first such remains were found, persisted here across thousands of years. Cro-Magnons and Neanderthals. Two approaches to the cold. It's worth noting that modern humans weren't the first to master cold Europe. Neanderthals had lived in the region long before Homo sapiens arrived for hundreds of thousands of years, and they too were adapted to a cold climate with stocky builds and, evidently, a culture that made use of fire and hides. Even so, when anatomically modern humans arrived in Europe around 40,000 to 45,000 years ago, Neanderthals disappeared as a distinct population within a few thousand years. The reasons remain a subject of active scientific debate: climatic fluctuations, competition over resources, differences in social organization and technology, and gradual assimilation through interbreeding may all have played a role, as evidenced by the small percentage of Neanderthal DNA present in nearly all modern non-African humans today. One of the most widely discussed factors is that the technology and social organization of Homo sapiens, based on the archaeological record, appear to have been more flexible and varied, which may have offered a real advantage precisely in the unstable, rapidly shifting climate of the Ice Age. The technology of the Ice Age. Surviving the mammoth steppe demanded solutions at the very edge of what the era could achieve. Clothing here wasn't just layered, it was well fitted to the body, a detail archaeologists reconstruct from the placement of bone needles, ornamentation, and preserved material traces at famous burial sites from this period, such as the Sungir burial in what's now Russia, where clothing was so densely embroidered with mammoth ivory beads that the arrangement of those beads allows researchers to reconstruct the precise cut of the garments, fitted trousers, belted tunics, fur caps. Shelters were built from whatever material was available in a largely treeless steppe, mammoth bones and tusks, as already discussed in the Arctic section, along with hides stretched over bone frameworks. At sites like this, archaeologists find traces of hearths inside the dwellings. Storage pits dug into the permafrost for keeping meat, essentially natural freezers, and dedicated areas for hide processing and tool-making. Hunting technology also grew markedly more sophisticated. Spear throwers appeared, significantly increasing the range and force of a thrown spear, allowing hunters to take on large, dangerous prey from a safer distance, alongside a wide range of stone tools for butchering carcasses, processing hides, and making clothing. Art as a survival tool. One of the most remarkable aspects of glacial Europe is the flourishing of symbolic and artistic thought precisely during this harsh period. The famous cave paintings at Lascaux and Chauvet in France, depicting horses, bison, and lions with astonishing skill, date to exactly this Upper Paleolithic era, a time of intense cold. The numerous so-called Paleolithic Venus figurines, small female statuettes found at sites across glacial Europe, from France to Siberia, also date to this period. Anthropologists suggest that art in these harsh conditions wasn't simply decoration for its own sake, but served a genuinely practical function, transmitting knowledge, strengthening social bonds within and between groups, and providing a ritual framework for making sense of the surrounding world. In other words, essentially another survival tool, one that worked through community cohesion and the preservation of collective memory. Burials and the depth of social organization. The Sungir burial, already mentioned above, reveals not just technical mastery in garment making, but also the depth of social structure within Ice Age communities. The burial contains the remains of an adult man and 2 children, interred with an enormous quantity of beads by some estimates. Producing all the ornamentation found there could have required several thousand hours of labor. Such a massive investment of resources into a funerary ritual points to a highly developed symbolic culture, to concepts of status and, likely, of an afterlife, and also suggests that Ice Age communities were large and organized enough to afford this kind of labor with no direct connection to day-to-day survival. In other words, by the peak of the last glaciation, humans were no longer merely a technologically inventive species, they were a species with a rich, social, and spiritual life. And that complexity of social organization appears to have been every bit as important a survival factor as any single technical invention. Why the rainforest is also a serious challenge. At first glance, the tropical rainforest looks like the opposite of every environment covered so far: warm year-round, plants in abundance, plenty of water. But that apparent ease long misled even researchers. It was once thought that dense, humid tropical forests were among the last places settled by humans, on the assumption that such an environment was poor in easily accessible, calorie-dense food and rife with dangers, from predators to parasites and disease. In reality, the rainforest presents a genuinely unique set of problems. Large herd animals, the kind convenient to hunt as a group, are far scarcer here than on open savannas or steppes. Forest prey tends to be small, fast, and widely scattered monkeys. Small ungulates, birds, and dense vegetation makes traditional drive hunting extremely difficult. The thick, humid environment also promotes the spread of parasites and infectious disease, including malaria, to a far greater degree than dry or cold regions do. Early evidence of life in rainforests. For a long time, the prevailing view was that humans only began truly settling dense tropical forests relatively late, preferring the open landscapes of savannas, where hunting large ungulates was more straightforward. Excavations over the past few decades, however, have substantially changed that picture. At Fa Hien Lina Cave in Sri Lanka, researchers found evidence of anatomically modern humans living in dense, humid tropical rainforest roughly 45,000 years ago, including specialized hunting tools clearly designed for taking small forest animals such as monkeys and squirrels. A similar picture emerges from the Naya caves on the island of Borneo in Southeast Asia, where traces of human presence in the rainforest also date back tens of thousands of years. These finds show that humans settled tropical forests far earlier and far more successfully than previously believed, developing hunting and gathering strategies specifically suited to the forest, distinct from those used on the savanna. Specialized forest technology. Hunting small, fast, often arboreal prey in dense vegetation required an entirely different technological toolkit than hunting large steppe animals. The bow and arrow, and in some regions, particularly Southeast Asia, the blowpipe with poisoned darts became key tools. They allowed hunters to bring down fast-moving prey, or prey high up in the canopy, from relatively short range, without the need for the long open pursuits that dense undergrowth made impossible. Just as critical to forest survival was an extraordinarily detailed knowledge of local plant life, which plants were edible, which were poisonous, which had medicinal properties, which could be used to make hunting poison, and which were suited to making rope, containers, or building materials. Among modern rainforest hunter-gatherer groups such as the Batek of Malaysia or various pygmy groups of Central Africa, the sheer scope of this kind of botanical knowledge, passed down orally across generations, continues to astonish researchers today, often running to many hundreds of individual plant species, each with a clearly defined practical use. Diet, health, and living alongside disease. Unlike the steppe or the desert, where the main threat comes from climatic extremes, in the tropical rainforest, one of the primary survival challenges isn't so much a scarcity of resources as it is infectious disease and parasites, which thrive in the warm, humid climate. Of particular interest to anthropologists is how certain populations that have long lived in high malaria regions, particularly in tropical Africa, developed distinctive genetic defense mechanisms. The best-known example is the mutation causing sickle-cell hemoglobin. In carriers of a single copy of this gene, red blood cells take on a shape considerably less hospitable to the malaria parasite, providing a notable protective advantage against malaria, even though carrying 2 copies of the gene instead causes a severe hereditary disease. It's a textbook example of the kind of trade-off evolution is willing to make in the face of a lethal infectious environment. Diet in the rainforest also demanded a distinct strategy. Because large, calorie-dense game is scarcer here than on the savanna, the traditional diet of forest communities tends to be considerably more varied, including large amounts of plant food, insects, fish from forest rivers and streams, and wild honey, an important source of concentrated calories that still holds a special place in the culture of many rainforest hunter-gatherer groups today. Rainforest peoples today. Central African pygmy peoples, such as the Mbuti, Aka, and Baka, and Southeast Asian hunter-gatherer groups, including the Batek and Semang, still maintain ways of life built largely on the profound knowledge of the rainforest accumulated over tens of thousands of years. Their relatively short stature, a trait found in several independently evolved pygmy populations across the tropical belt of the planet, remains a subject of ongoing scientific debate. Hypotheses include adaptation to limited caloric availability in the forest environment, particular features of thermoregulation suited to a hot, humid climate, and possible advantages of a compact build when moving through dense vegetation. There's no scientific consensus on this question yet, and it remains one of the open problems in modern anthropology. Looking across these 5 wildly different environments, the searing cold of the Arctic, the parching heat of the desert, the thin air of the high mountains, the icy steppes of Paleolithic Europe, and the humid, life and danger-filled density of the tropical rainforest, one shared principle stands out, at work in every single case. Humans, as a biological species, don't come pre-equipped with specialized survival tools for any one of these environments. We don't have an Arctic fox's fur, a camel's reserves, a yak's lungs. What actually allowed humans to settle this entire, almost unbelievable range of conditions is, first, technology, clothing, fire, shelter, hunting tools, reinvented each time to meet the specific challenge of a specific environment. Second, knowledge, accumulated over far more than a single lifetime and passed down across generations. Where to find water in the desert, which plant is poisonous in the forest, how to sew clothing for a polar night. Third, Social organization and cooperation, whether that meant hunting a mammoth together, collectively producing thousands of beads for a funerary ritual, or exchanging knowledge between groups across centuries. And only fourth, and not always actual biological adaptation, a body shape suited to cold, a strong capacity for sweating in heat, a gene inherited from the Denisovans for life at altitude, a protective mutation against malaria in the forest. These biological changes are real, and they matter. But they nearly always followed cultural solutions rather than preceding them, and often took considerably longer to develop than it took humans simply to pick up and move into a new, seemingly uninhabitable environment in the first place. That combination, a flexible, culturally programmable species, capable of compensating for almost any biological shortcoming through ingenuity, knowledge, and cooperation, is, arguably, the central secret behind how a primate with no natural fitness whatsoever for any of these extremes became the only large mammal species to settle literally every corner of the planet's habitable land, from the Arctic Circle to the equator.